The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. We are back, loving baseball when we were 12 and innocent. I'm Ralph Tycho of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and my guest today is esteemed writer Steve Goldleaf. How are you, sir?
I'm excellent. Thank you.
Good. I hope you like the topic. Here's my thinking on it. When we were 12 and passionate about baseball, as you were, it was the first time that passion met intellect. We were at 12 old enough to understand what was going on. It wasn't just, wow, Mickey Mantle's my favorite ball player, this, that, and the other thing. We could think about it. And the innocent part, when you're 12, haven't even been bar mitzvahed yet. So everything is a world of innocence. And I want to start you off, Steve, by talking about what year you were 12 and what was your favorite baseball experience.
Well, you picked a good year. I was actually thinking that the goal when you're around that age is really to think of yourself as having the potential to be an adult. And baseball for me, and I suspect for you and a million other guys, was really the first area where you could hold your own. You could be talking with some grown-up guys, and if you were sharp enough and if you could articulate well enough, you could actually make arguments that maybe they couldn't understand or they couldn't see or they felt differently on, and you could be an equal. And that was really, I think, the attraction of baseball. It could have been anything, really. It could have been, Charles Dickens if you were, a precocious reader or something like that. But I'm saying for most people, their interest would be in baseball. And, it was around that age, I think, that you could come to the understanding, oh, you know what, I understand this stuff better than my cousin Barry. And I'm going to disagree with him about, the Cincinnati Reds second baseman. That was very heady. You know what I'm saying?
You learned to debate as opposed to argue. And am I right? You learned that you could talk to people and have a disagreement and not make it an argument. That's how it was. Or sometimes it was an argument and you just have to defend yourself verbally. It's a great age. Great age. You grew up in New York. Were you a Yankee fan, a Giant fan, or a Dodger fan?
Yeah. Well, actually, the great thing for me was realizing that I could say stuff that wouldn't be kid stuff. I remember actually what I did when I was a little younger, and I pronounced the name of the Cardinal second baseman as Julian Javier, and this cracked up my older cousin. They corrected me how to pronounce that, so I promptly did the same thing with Hoey Hay, who was a
first little league pitcher to pitch in the majors, if I remember correctly.
So stop doing that kind of thing, and you start being taken seriously. That's like I said, a very heady experience. Being okay, you can join the conversation. We're not going to patronize you, and we're not going to talk down to you, and we're not going to roll our eyes when your mouth opens up. We're going to listen, and that was a great experience. But back to 1965, which is when I was 12, I was actually just thinking about this the other day because I had a very vivid memory of being in a relative's house, and Ron Swoboda was off to an amazing start in the 1965 season. He had I just remember seeing his name in the newspaper, and he was either tied with or maybe one home run behind Willie Mays very early in the season. And this was a night when I was out at this relative's house in Queens, and we were watching the Met game on TV, and I guess I was mature enough to understand that Ron Swoboda wasn't quite Willie Mays.
Right, not quite.
The newspaper said.
Yeah. Are you cutting off a little bit? Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Oh, good. Did the Mets become your favorite team?
Oh, yeah, almost from the very beginning.
Okay. Let me ask you this. You mentioned that you were a Ron Hunt supporter. And I read that on Facebook, and I put myself in a position of where was I? I was getting a haircut when they announced that Ron Hunt was the first legitimate New York Met All-Star. They had Richie Ashburn the first year was an All-Star because they had to fill out the roster with every team. But Ron Hunt in 1963, he came from the Braves, and he was the first legitimate All-Star. And I was at Harry's Barbershop on Northern Boulevard in Jackson Heights. And Harry was the worst barber in history. But he always had a bunch of magazines and newspapers in there to read. So I was getting my hair cut, and that's how I really thought of Ron Hunt when you mentioned it. Tell me your thoughts on Ron Hunt and what your reason for being drawn to him.
Well, for one thing, I would dispute your description of him as legitimate, just because every ball player in the National League, I think, including his own teammates, tended to think of Ron Hunt as a bastard. He had a
little play on words there. That's beautiful. I like that. He would take pitches, and he'd be hit by pitches consistently.
Really until later in his career, when he got on the Expos, that he started really, getting hit by a pitch on a regular basis. When I looked this up, I was a little surprised. I mean, he did get hit by a pitch more than other ball players did, but it wasn't that much more. He would get hit by a pitch, 10, 12 times in a year, when your average player would maybe get hit 5 times in a year. But it wasn't until he got to the Expos that he started racking up, 50 hit by pitches in a single season, which I think is, still the record or very close to it. But a disagreeable player. He would bump fielders when he was trying to get into second base. And Stengel loved him. I mean, he was really the first. What I enjoyed about Ron Hunt was he was the first Met who was out there, thinking, well, we're going to win today. We're not going to, get shellacked 18-4, and I'm going to be playing very hard-nosed baseball in the ninth inning, even if we're a couple of runs down. And he sort of, gave us what we needed at that time. I'm talking about his very early days, 63, 64, which was hope, which was just getting to think, okay, maybe we actually could win, maybe not this season, but maybe next year. And that was really the appeal of Ron Hunt, I think, was just his hard-nosed attitude that, told the other ball players, well, we're here to play your real game. Right.
That 63 season for me as a Met fan was very, very disappointing. I thought it was cutesy that they lost all those games, and the books were written about the 62 Mets and all that, and you could almost live with it. as a kid who grew up in New York, where excellence was expected. You had the Yankees and the Dodgers, and even the Giants in '54 and '51. You had a lot of greatness. To see your favorite team lose 120, and the next year not really improve. I mean, they made what I consider to be the worst trade in their history, if you don't talk about Nolan Ryan. They traded a relief pitcher named Bob Miller, the righty Bob Miller, not the lefty Bob Miller, which is another story. And they traded him for two Dodger, not only prospects, but were guys who they really high on, Tim Harkness and, pardon me?
I said Larry Burright.
Larry Burright. I knew middle infielder, and they both sucked. I mean, just the way it was. So Tim, I blanked on the name. Ron Hunt was, like you say, a welcome breath of fresh air on a team that wasn't going anywhere, but he played as if they were. And at age 12, that had to make you, as kids, that made us understand that it's more than playing out the string and getting up and grounding out, or whatever. It's trying, and that's a life's lesson right there. Putting effort into it, whether you're winning or not. And you mentioned Casey. Any stories or anything that comes to mind about Casey that's interesting from your standpoint as a fan?
Well, I mean, one of the things actually ties in with Larry Burright, which is that because the Mets had traded one of their better players. I mean, Miller actually went on to have a really good career.
Absolutely.
After he left the Mets. And because they'd given up so much to get Burright, I guess Stengel felt under some pressure to make Burright the starting second baseman, which he was, to open the 1963 season. I think he played, a handful of games, maybe, 6 or 8 or something like that. And, like you said, he stunk. Really wasn't, a major league hitter. In fact, you could probably argue that he, more than anyone else, was the weak link in the 62 Dodgers, because they gave him a fair amount of playing time, and he didn't do well there, and they lost that pennant, as you know, by the slimmest of margins in a playoff game. So the Mets got him, and they decided, well, we have to play this guy. He's why we traded Miller. He didn't do well, and Hunt was agitating on the bench, just saying to Stengel, give me a chance, let me in there, give me a start, let me show you what I can do. And so that's what Hunt had to do to get into Stengel's good graces. He just nudged him every day until Stengel finally gave him a start, and he did well in the start. In fact, I don't think this was the game, but I do remember one of the very first game-winning hits that Hunt ever got, maybe his first for that matter. They were playing the Braves, and they were down a run or two in the 8th or 9th inning, and Hunt got up and he hit a double, and he drove in a couple of runs, I think, and that was a big victory. Well, any victory was a big victory because the Mets at that time so rarely any kind.
You'd have a block party if they won.
What's that?
You'd have a block party if they won. In other words, everybody would come out and celebrate. I heard a great Leonard Copper told me this story about two guys meet, and one guy says, "How'd the Mets do?" And the Mets scored 16 runs. He tells his buddy, "Did they win?" That was the question.
Actually, remember that game? Cubs.
What'd you say about the Cubs? We are cutting out just a bit.
Oh, I said, actually, I remember that story in that game. It was a game against the Cubs where they scored a whole bunch of runs, and the question was, well, did they win?
Yeah.
The thing, it's really funny because I don't really, have a clear memory of a lot of specific games from when I was a kid. I probably could tell you anecdotes about maybe, 8 or 10 games of the hundreds that I listened to in those years, mostly on the radio, I think. But that one hit that I was just telling you about that Hunt got very early in his career, I also remember that what was going on for me personally was that my mother had driven me and my little brother to New Jersey, and we were coming back, and we were just about to go into the Holland Tunnel. And Hunt was coming up to the plate. And I remember that was the last thing that happened before we went into the tunnel. And, we got cut off, and that would have been the most frustrating thing of all, to be listening to this whole tedious game where the Mets were losing on the radio, and then to, go into the tunnel just when they were, down to their last out or two. And I just remember he hit the double, and the Mets won the game, and then we went into the tunnel. And I remember that being one of the most satisfying moments of my entire childhood. Was just, I think I must have been 11 at that time. And it was just incredibly satisfying to, have that game resolve in that particular way. It was just a moment that I had never gotten over.
Nice memory. Who brought you to baseball as a kid? Was it your dad or uncles, grandfather?
It was my cousin Jerry. He was about, I would say, 8 years older than I was. And he would take me and my brother to mostly, I don't think we went to the Polo Grounds once, but I think in 1964 we started going to Shea Stadium. And
right.
Jerry would sort of, I guess, he was doing my parents a favor, or they might have been, probably were, paying him a couple of bucks just to take care of us for the day and, give my parents a little peace and quiet. But I remember that, we would get taken out to the ballpark actually it was very often on the subway, although Jerry eventually had a car that he took us in. And, this is one of these deals where I felt that I could begin to assert my views in a way that was equitable. And it was really great, just to go out. And I guess we did this all through 64, 65, 66. And that was really, a very epical moment. I don't know if actually, the first baseball game I ever went to was with my dad. Roger Maris had hit 60 home runs. And I convinced my dad to take me to my very first baseball game. And this wasn't typical. He wasn't the kind of dad who liked going out to the ballpark with his kid. I think this is the only game I ever went to with my dad. But I convinced him to take me out to Yankee Stadium so we could watch Roger Maris hit his 61st home run. And
oh, wow.
That was actually the day before he hit the 61st homer. So I've looked up the box score since then, and it was actually the game that Don Schwal pitched for the Red Sox. And, Maris got, I think, a single that day. But that was the first Major League game I ever saw, and the last one I ever saw with my dad. But like I said, mostly it was my older cousin who was fanatical Cincinnati Reds fan. So during the 61 season, I remember during that summer, I was actually rooting for the Reds just because my cousin was rooting for the Reds, and he was a big Veda Pinson fan. So right now, in fact, I'm looking at a ceramic baseball that my daughter made for me that is inscribed Veda Pinson on it, because I told her all these stories about growing, and she has no idea who Pinson was, but she just knew that he was an important figure in my early life, and it was very present that she.
You'll be happy to know that the guy you rooted for was a tremendous human being. I had Veda Pinson Jr. on as a guest, and I live in Northern California in Oakland, close to Oakland, where Veda Pinson, Frank Robinson, and Kurt Flood all played for McClymonds High School at the same time. What an outfield that was.
And isn't that where Bill Russell also went to school?
Yes, it is. And Paul Silas and Jesse Gonder, speaking of the Mets. I don't know if you remember, he was a catcher he was the great hope. He wasn't a white hope. He was a black hope, but he had nothing but mediocre catchers early on. And Gonder was a hitter, and they got him, I think it was 65. But yes, McClymonds has an incredible sports history. And like I told his son after a show of him talking about Veda's life, his son really wants to get Veda in the Hall of Fame, naturally. And I told him, whatever, if he gets in the Hall of Fame or not, he was a Hall of Fame dad. And that's much more important than the Hall of Fame. But that red team, to me, in 61 was terrific. In those days, any team that played the Yankees, you rooted for. And so it wasn't that difficult, I'm sure, rooting for the Reds. Frank Robinson, Eddie Casco, a bunch of good ball players. So that was 61.
A big supporter of Veda Pinson Jr. I've signed his petitions, and I've been pretty active on his Facebook site and places like that, because I mean, there are so many players who are in that category of being good enough to be elected to the Hall of Fame, but who just weren't elected to the Hall of Fame. And you could make a case for any of these terrific ball players.
Who would be the first of those that you would make a case for? If not, let's leave Veda Pinson out of it. He's as close to, he's as good as any of them. But who would you prefer to see in?
Well, the player that I think I would most favor, certainly from a sentimental viewpoint, but also from a rational viewpoint, would be Gil Hodges, just because his playing career is, I think, one of those marginal careers like Pinson's where the stats are comparable, but they're not overwhelming compared to the people who are in the Hall of Fame. But I think the managerial part of Hodges' story is really what puts him way over the line for me. That you have somebody who's on in the gray area to start with, but when he, does literally a miraculous job of taking an atrocious organization and making them into world's champions, that's just, to me, it's a no-brainer.
Good choice. I'd have to add, from my standpoint, Minnie Minoso would be someone I'd love to see in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like I'm saying, there's a whole cadre of players, Tony Oliva, Dick Allen, who are, just really strong candidates. And the argument goes that they have better careers than some of the players who are in there. And I guess that the counter argument is, okay, but those are mistakes. Those are people who shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame, and there's no reason to add others who have similar records just because we made a mistake or 12 in admitting.
Mistake or 12. That is very well put. That can stop a lot of disagreements right there. Who would be the first person that you'd take out if you, along those lines, that you personally don't think really belongs there?
Well, there are a lot of these names, and I think, Bill James in particular, who I used to work for. I worked for him, writing a column up through this May. But Bill has argued very strongly that a lot of the players in the Hall of Fame, who you never saw play and I never saw play, but who accrued a lot of stats that we maybe don't think that much of at this point. But, I would say you get somebody like Lloyd Wainer, who, some people say that he's in the Hall of Fame because his brother was a great player and people associated him with his brother. But, he was a singles hitter. He was a center fielder who got a lot of hits but not a lot of walks. So he didn't have much of an on-base percentage. But, of course, in the 1930s, 1940s, I don't know when, I think Wainer got elected sometime in the 50s or the 60s. But people in those days didn't really make much of getting on base. They said, this guy has a lot of hits, so let's honor that. But if you look at his statistical record, you're going, yeah, he's kind of a good ball player. He's better than Omar Moreno. He's probably better than Mookie Wilson, but that ain't a Hall of Fame player. And I think there are a lot of those examples. I don't mean to pick on poor Lloyd Wainer, but there are a lot of people in the Hall of Fame who had careers that, in retrospect, we look at and we go, yeah, I don't really see this as a Hall of Fame career. I think there are a lot of them. There maybe as many as, 20 or 30 players in the Hall of Fame who, if you could do it all over again, wouldn't have a chance of being elected.
Steve, what are your views on Shoeless Joe Jackson and Pete Rose, and in relationship to whether or not they should be in the Hall?
Well, this gets back to Gil Hodges, because what I think one of the stronger arguments I could make for Gil Hodges going in the Hall of Fame is the character clause in the Hall of Fame guidelines. That this is a real puzzler for me, and I've actually written a little bit about this. Just what do we mean by character? And it doesn't seem to mean very much for the Hall of Fame credentials. And I would say that, as much as Hodges' character counts positively, and this isn't to say that I agree with every, example in Hodges' career, because I think he had his problems too, but they weren't of character-based nature. I think he was somewhat rigid and maybe a little bit too militaristic and stern in his dealings with players. And certainly, I think one of the things against Hodges is that he didn't show very good judgment in his feelings about Nolan Ryan's potential. I think, the legend has it that he was for trading Ryan for a bag of used baseballs. But those aren't character issues. Those are judgment issues, and, people make mistakes. But I think he was such an outstanding role model and just in general a great positive player and manager that you look at that and you go, okay, well, that should count as a positive. Whereas if somebody, does something like Rose or Jackson or, to my mind, Roger Clemens or Barry Bonds, I would say, you know what? This is where the character clause comes in, and it means something. That you don't let somebody into the Hall of Fame if they've done in violation either of the rules or of the practices of the game.
Okay. We're running short on time. The question I want to ask you is, what was your reading material like at age 12 regarding baseball? What books influenced you? What magazines did you like to have arrive at the candy store, if you will?
Well, my dad had a candy store. When I was a little kid, he had a candy store on McDonald and Albemarle, I think, in the middle of Brooklyn.
Wow.
I got to do a lot of reading.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I would that I loved reading during the summer, I think, a really influential writer on my baseball consciousness was Dick Young of the Daily News. And I would read his column, and he would just be an incredibly exciting writer that I didn't really understand what I was absorbing at that point. I just knew that Young always wrote about things that were controversial in a very direct way that seemed to contrast with a lot of the lifeless sports reporting that appeared in the other papers. And this is really funny because, like I'm saying about Gil Hodges, but much more so with Dick Young, I really, as I grew up, really didn't care for his personality or his tastes, and he's one of the villains of the Tom
Seaver. Yeah.
As I'm concerned. But I think his prose, which I got to understand on a professional level, just analyzing it as a writer, from reading Roger Kahn's Boys of Summer. And he would sort of explain how Young would be this belligerent, almost directly nasty person, very competitive and very proud of his sources and of his direct writing. And I really got a feel for what was behind the prose of those columns. But I just remember in the summer we would go up to the Catskills and we would get the Daily News up there on a daily basis, which we never did in the city. So in July and August, I would be reading every day Young's column, which he called Young Ideas, which again is kind of funny because by the end he was the avatar of old ideas and tired ideas and boring conservative reactionary ideas. But he wrote this column called Young Ideas, and it was just a great experience, I think, just reading that sort of rat-a-tat-tat style. And he would get into it with ball players. He would call out ball players who he was unhappy with for one reason or another, and very often that reason was that they weren't as much into the game as he wanted them to be. And I think he was one of the influences on. He certainly loved the way Ron Hunt played the game, because Hunt would be, like I said before, one of these hard-nosed players, and Young would be full of praise for that style, and not so much for players who didn't show that sort of eagerness to compete.
Okay. I have another question. I could probably keep saying this for about 4 hours in our talks. What was Bill James like? Anything about him that stands out that you'd want to share with the audience?
Well, it's kind of funny, actually. If I can do a little plug here, when I say I got fired, I mean I got fired. Bill got mad at me and pulled the plug on me. in the middle of my writing for him, and I actually wrote a couple of pieces on a website called Authory, which is basically the word author with a Y at the end of it, .com /Steven Goldleaf. And I actually just submitted the fourth column in which I went into some detail of what exactly the issue was with me and Bill. And I think the problem there was just that, like Bill, I'm a contrarian. I think, if somebody says something, I immediately want to analyze it and see where I differ from that statement. And I think I did that once too often with Bill on his own website. He just decided that he didn't like the way in which I was not genuflecting at his wisdom, and I would often challenge him. Very often what I would do is I would write a column that disputed what he said in some column or other, and I thought it was lively. I thought it was like, okay, let's give people a chance to see both sides of this issue. And
debate.
Were encouraging that, I thought. But apparently, he could only tolerate so much of it, and I have an endless supply, so it was inevitable.
Where can the listeners see your daily writings, Steve?
Well, if they go to that website, actually, I managed, just through sheer luck. I mean, I just saw the website, and I thought it was an interesting site, the Authory.com site. And I actually had 180 Bill James columns imported to that site. So they can read, any of my columns, from the last 6 years on that. And since Authory has a way to publish other parts, I'm going to be importing, not only baseball writing, but my writing on a variety of other subjects. What I was doing for James for the last couple of years, Bill had at one point mentioned that he liked the idea of having a regular book reviewer. So for the last 2 years, I would say, almost half of my columns were reviews of baseball books as they came out. So, I've got a bunch of reviews of recent books on the site now. And I've also got a whole bunch of columns that are about other related subjects. Some of them are kind of far off the mark. Some of them are on politics. Some of them are on the English language. So it's a pretty, wide-ranging mix.
Eclectic, if you will.
Exactly. That's a good word.
All right. What, Steve, what would be your passion in life if it weren't for baseball? What do you think? Could have been model airplanes, but what would have you been excited about? What would you be talking to some podcaster about today if baseball weren't a part of your life?
Well, it's a funny thing, Ralph. I was just talking to my brother an hour or so ago, and I happened to mention that I've specialized as an academic in a very unusual area, which is I specialize in the writings of Irish-American drunks. And right now in the middle of completing a novel that was started by the Irish-American, although actually a lot of his ancestry was English, but a writer named Richard Yates. And Dick Yates was actually my teacher in graduate school and a great influence on me as a writer. And he was writing a novel about the year that he spent as Bobby Kennedy's speechwriter in the year that JFK got assassinated. And he'd gotten 5 chapters into writing this novel when he dropped dead. And
Whoa.
This was over 20 years ago. And I've looked at the manuscript. I published a book on Dick Yates's work, and I got to see the manuscript, which is now in the archives at Boston University, and I realized, I think I can finish this novel. I think I know where he was going, and I have some ideas for where he could have gone, and so that's what I'm doing these days. I'm about almost 25 chapters into completing the last novel of Richard Yates, and I'm kind of excited about it because I think there's a chance that this could see publication, and it would be a real contribution. So that's the thing that I'm the most passionate about, is the writers like Richard Yates and John O'Hara and F. Scott Fitzgerald, like I'm saying, have in common the fact that they were all tremendously heavy drinkers, and I hardly drink at all, and they were Irish, and I don't have an ounce of Irish in me, but I just love these guys' ways of expressing their thoughts. I think that's just, the most interesting thing to me in the world.
An Irish drunk is incredibly open with their feelings. They're not going to go in the corner and hide. They'll let you know how they feel, not what they think so much, but how they feel. You got to admire that.
You do. I mean, I just think these guys are I don't even know what it is exactly. I mean, I was just thinking about this, that, some writers, I can just read them, and they can be writing about nothing at all. And I'm just fascinated by the way that they put together a sentence and how comfortable they are and how their tone is just letter perfect. And the content hardly even matters to me, although sometimes the content is pretty interesting. And certainly the year that, Yates was writing for speeches for Bobby Kennedy, and that he was writing speeches on civil rights, which is one of the hottest subjects around, voter registration for black voters in the South. And, so I put a whole bunch of his speeches into this book, which is, I just think, a fascinating thing to see. And, it's just a marvel how he was able to convey such power and passion and humanity into these what had been very dull and dry speeches by Bobby Kennedy before Richard Yates found him. And Kurt Vonnegut said that Richard Yates used Bobby Kennedy as a ventriloquist's dummy.
Wow. What high praise.
Isn't that a great image, though?
Yes. I can see little Bobby sitting on his lap, just taking it all in. Hey, Steve, speaking of interesting people, you are that. I hope it won't be as long before you come back and visit again.
I would love to.
Good. If you're enjoying this, believe me, I'm enjoying it 5 times more. Steve Goldleaf, I'm Ralph Tycho, Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and I had a blast, Steve. Thank you, and thank you out there for listening. Happy trails, and be safe. Be safe. Bye, Steve.
So long, Ralph.
All right.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices, and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.